Did you know that when you subscribe to the podcast, you make it easier for other people to find the Family Bible Journey? So please follow and subscribe. And thanks for listening. This is episode 399, season 1 of the Family Bible Journey Old Testament podcast. Today we're looking at Proverbs chapter 2. The title of today's podcast is Wisdom is a Shield. And our key verses for today, the entirety of Proverbs 2, where we read, My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding, yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path. For wisdom will come into your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will watch over you, understanding will guard you, delivering you from the way of evil, from men of perverted speech, who forsake the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perverseness of evil, men whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. So you will be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death, and her paths to the departed. None who go to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life. So you will walk in the way of the good, and keep to the paths of the righteous. For the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. This is the word of the Lord. Here in chapter 2, we see a continuation of the discourse of King Solomon to his son. And as the chapter begins, speaking specifically to his son, it is good for us to recognize that Solomon here, in recording these words of wisdom, is doing so to his son Rehoboam, who is going to inherit the throne of Israel. And he is seeking, by sharing the wisdom of the Lord with his son, and he knows is going to reign in his stead once he has departed to be with the Lord in glory. He wants to bless this son with wisdom, that not only his son, but indeed all of God's people then living in the land of Israel would be blessed as the nation is continued to be governed with the wisdom of God instead of the foolishness of men. And so if you are a female listener, a woman or a girl or a young woman who is listening to this passage, and you're hearing this, what some would say, sexist language in Proverbs, recognize that these words are recorded not only for Solomon's son, who, unfortunately, if you've followed along our podcasts and the Kings and the books of the Kings and the Chronicles, was not wise, and Solomon himself, who, because of his tremendous adultery during his life, proved to not always put into practice the words of his lips. Don't be offended, but rather understand that this is the context of this book of wisdom, and all of God's people are going to benefit, male or female, from listening to the Lord and learning to walk in his ways. And I know that it isn't a big deal for many of the listeners of the podcast, but it is a sensitive issue for some, what some people would consider sexist language of the Bible. But please hear it, not as we would judge it through our cultural context, but rather in the context in which it was delivered and the purpose it was originally intended for, so that we would benefit from listening and learning by the Spirit's guidance, as Solomon was hoping his son would. I have a note also on verse 11. It's one of those words of wisdom sections. It's also the title of today's podcast, where it says, Wisdom is a shield for your soul. And this is good for us to remember as God's people. Wisdom does not inoculate us like a vaccine does, preventing us from getting any sickness. Most of us were reminded again during the season that was COVID that vaccines don't always prevent you from getting sick. They oftentimes do. But as was the case with the COVID vaccine, if you had received the vaccine, if you got COVID, you were likely to not be as adversely affected by it because you had received the vaccine. And I don't think that is a matter of politics. I think that is a matter of scientific fact, at least from my own reading and research. And so for us as God's people to recognize that when we embrace God's way, when we seek to walk in the way of wisdom, this does not mean that we're not going to suffer during this life. It doesn't mean that bad things aren't going to happen to us because we do live in a sinful world. But there are many evils that we can be protected from simply by walking in the Lord's way and seeking to live our lives according to His wisdom for our lives. And we see a fairly lengthy section in verses 16 to 19 towards the tail end of chapter 2, where Solomon extols the virtues of chastity and some of the consequences of adultery. And he talks about wisdom delivering his son from the forbidden woman, that her house sinks down to death, that in her midst are many who have gone astray, many who have departed, many who, because of their sexual sin with the adulteress, will never rise again. And sexual sin is a pervasive evil of every age, because human beings were created by God for sexual relations with others, in particular the person to whom they were married. But any time that we as God's people take sex out of the context of marriage, we are risking many negative consequences for ourselves, for our future marriage. If we are engaging in premarital sex, we are engaging in behaviors that are going to be harmful to our future relationships because there are trust issues involved with those who are consorting sexually with those they are not married to once they are married. And a very easy way to see how this principle is illustrated is simply the risk of sexually transmitted diseases. The reality is that if you are not engaging in premarital or extramarital sex, you are much less likely statistically to a tremendous magnitude of degree of getting any of these sorts of illnesses or diseases, which unfortunately are all too common in the world that we live in. And so wisdom in this chapter, it is depicted for us as a shield. It doesn't mean that we're not going to suffer. It doesn't mean that we're not going to be afflicted. It doesn't mean that we aren't going to have bad things happen to us. But what it means is that we can be protected from many of the preventable difficulties, illnesses, and struggles of those who are wantonly treacherous in their way, or those who blindly and boldly sin, oftentimes not even knowing or even caring that they are doing wrong. So this chapter, it encourages us to live in godliness, seeing God's wisdom as a shield that protects us. And this is a mature view of the role of God's law in our lives. The spiritually immature oftentimes see God's laws as interfering with fun or keeping something back from us, but rather in this section, we see that God in His wisdom, He protects us. He shields us from the preventable evils in our lives. And for this reason, we value, we love, and we trust God's wisdom. And we seek to walk in His way, recognizing that when we do, His wisdom is a shield, protecting us from many unnecessary evils and unnecessary suffering that those who wantonly go astray often inflict upon themselves and those around them. If you'd like to share your faith in a super easy way, or send a note of encouragement to a friend, Click the share button so you can send an episode to a friend in a text or an email, or post on social media. Our blessing for today. May wisdom shield your heart, mind, and spirit from the seduction of sin. Amen.